could find online to present this. And people were wondering why people in Toronto, why the Caribbean community, the Black community was so upset, because of course the acquittal was of the officers who beat Rodney King. But people in Toronto were upset because there had been a series of shootings of unarmed Black men and one woman over the span of a few years. And so this was just the catalyst that resulted in what was called the Yonge Street Uprising. So here are a few snapshots from some images I was able to find online. So here you see some looting happening during the Yonge Street riots and uprising. Here you see some police officers on horseback creating a perimeter and trying to contain the protesters. And here you see some police officers with batons beating protesters here on horseback. So I want to go back to Dudley Laws. We saw his picture earlier with the family of Michael Wade Lawson. And Dudley Laws was a member of the Black Action Defense Committee. He was actually one of the founders of the Black Action Defense Committee. And he, even well before this, had said that he didn't trust a police officer's ability to conduct internal investigations. And so he's quoted as saying, "We are not anti-police, we're anti-police violence. And we have said to them that you cannot investigate yourselves." So as a result of the uprising and the activism of Dudley Laws for many years, the Premier of Ontario, Bob Rae, commissioned a report, an Ontario-wide report on race relations. And the person that he tasked to do this was Stephen Lewis. So Stephen Lewis was a former politician. He was also the deputy director of UNICEF at the time. And he spent 38 days writing a 40-page report on race relations in Ontario. And you can get this report online. And when you read this report, it's interesting because he's writing directly to Bob Rae, the Premier. So he uses you all the time, and I'll give you some examples of that. And his writing is almost poetic as he talks about what he's uncovered through this investigation, through this task force. But I'm just going to read one of the things that he said about the criminal justice system. He said, "If ever I felt two solitudes in life, it's the apparent chasm between the Metropolitan Toronto Police and many representatives of the Black community." So last summer, I was in Toronto and I was helping my parents downsize. So I was in the basement, we were going through old boxes we hadn't gone through in years. And I found a pink copy of the Stephen Lewis report in my parents' basement. And you know when you have these moments when you're an adult and you read something from the time that you might have been a teenager or a child, and it just kind of reorients you to your experiences? That was that moment for me. And that's when I learned that my father had served on this committee. So here are a couple scans of some pages from this report. So Stephen Lewis says, "First, what we are dealing with at root and fundamentally is anti-Black racism." Okay, so he calls out specifically anti-Black racism in Southern Ontario. He mentions that it's the Black community that's the focus, the Black young people who are being shot. He mentions unemployment. He mentions Black students being inappropriately streamed in schools, so putting Black students into remedial classes rather than advanced classes. He talks about jobs. So really this report is talking about all of the different systems within Ontario society and how anti-Black racism is prominent across all of these systems. But he spent quite a bit of time talking about the criminal justice system. And then I underlined this, where he says, "Just as the soothing balm of multiculturalism cannot mask racism, so racism cannot mask its primary target, which is Black people." And there was another quote in the report where somebody said, a person of color said, "The Blacks are out front and we are all lined up behind them." This is the second page that I thought it would be helpful to scan and look at. And these highlights were just highlights that I had done for a different purpose last summer. But He talks about the fact that people were weary, that they thought that they were engaged in another reporting charade. He talks about it being depressing for him and mentions that government initiatives had to come soon and they had to be fundamental. And then he talks about fear from members of the Black community and in particular mothers. And he talks about the 8 shootings that happened in Toronto over 4 years. And then he says this: the sense, real or imagined, of unpredictable police encounters with Black youth has many families very frightened. And this idea, real or imagined, might seem dismissive, but I think what's important to keep in mind is that even though he uses the word that it might be imagined, he still takes it seriously because he recognizes that when you have fear in a community, the quality of life has been depressed. And so writing to the Premier, he says, "I'll admit to you that nothing left so indelible an impression upon me as the expressions of apprehension and fear. I can't even begin to imagine it about my own children, nor could you." So speaking as a white man to another white man. And then he says, "We must find a way out of the present tension because it's intolerable in this society to know that, as one woman puts it, mothers see their sons walk out the door and they never sleep until their sons walk back in." So out of that report and that task force came a number of initiatives. Some were more directly related to that task force and others came over time. The first one is the Police Community Liaison Committee. And the reason why that doesn't have a hyperlink next to it is because it actually doesn't exist anymore. So this was the committee that my father served on for a couple of years. And one of the challenges with this committee, they were tasked with being a liaison between the community and police officers. And they would take recommendations from the Black community to high-ranking police officers, like commissioners. And then the commissioners would take those recommendations and take it back to their police departments, and maybe something would come of it and maybe it wouldn't. There wasn't really a good feedback loop in how the police were responding to this liaison committee. Another challenge with the Police Community Liaison Committee is that there were different definitions of what it meant to enhance police-community relations. So the community wanted accountability, okay? They wanted accountability, they wanted oversight. But from the police perspective, what that liaison committee was supposed to do to enhance relations was to basically just be the ambassadors of the police officers to the community, to let the community know that everything was okay, these officers mean well, they're just doing their job. But fundamentally, if there's mistrust from a community, being the ambassador of the police department isn't really going to do a whole lot to enhance police-community relations. And so that was kind of this tightrope that they were walking. And as a result, this committee didn't really last very long. I think it lasted for a couple of years beyond my father being part of it. But there were a couple other things that emerged from this. One was the Special Investigations Unit. Now, this Special Investigations Unit was established in 1990. So it was established before the Yonge Street Uprising and before the Stephen Lewis Report. But after the Stephen Lewis Report, this was strengthened. So I'm going to link to it here just to give you a little example of what this looks like. So this is a provincial level, so the entire province of Ontario, so the equivalent of a state, right? Provincial level civilian oversight. If you look at it, it says that their mission has been to nurture public confidence in policing by ensuring that the conduct of police officers in cases which fall under the SIU jurisdiction is subject to rigorous and independent investigation. And their motto is independent investigations, community confidence. So the sense isn't that community confidence is raised by kind of being an ambassador for the police, but it's raised when you have clear investigations. Just going to click on a couple other links here, and I've shared all of these links with Geneva. So after this talk, she's going to drop these links into the chat so you can copy and paste them. But they investigate anything that's considered to be a serious injury. And a serious injury includes anything that's likely to interfere with the health or comfort of the victim. All right, and so the injury has to be more than transient. So if it results in the individual being in a hospital, a fracture to a limb, a rib, a vertebrae, the skull, a burn, anything that results in loss of hearing, vision, sexual assault, anything like that immediately gets referred to the Special Investigations Unit. And they use the word victim, even though the person who might be hurt they might be somebody who committed a crime. But any interaction with law enforcement and a civilian that results in the civilian being hurt will result in an independent civilian investigation. It's important to keep in mind that civilian can mean somebody who has a law enforcement background but isn't currently working in law enforcement. Okay, so the investigators there, they have several lead investigators. Some have a law enforcement background, some don't. And then they have a lot of as-needed investigators who do have law enforcement backgrounds who conduct these investigations. And then I'll share with you the investigation process right here. So the SIU examines and secures physical evidence. They interview witnesses. So this is all independent, arm's length, not in collaboration with police at all. And that is existing at the provincial level. Okay, so whether you are the Ontario Provincial Police, whether you're a regional police officer or from a small or large municipality, you fall under this jurisdiction. All right, if it's not a severe injury, then the next type of oversight is the Office of the Independent Police Review Director. And I'm just going to show you a couple of links here. So this is where you would make complaints about things that have to do with discourtesy, being mistreated, being ignored. And they talk about accountability, integrity, and independence. If you look at their mission, it's to provide effective management and oversight of public complaints, to promote accountability of police services across Ontario, and increase confidence in public complaint systems, okay? And so then they talk about how they do that. But here, if you click on complaints, they walk you through how to make a complaint. They talk about the complaint process. So if you click on here, you're gonna see sort of like a Venn diagram that shows you every step of the complaint process, the different levels. And then you can also access complaint forms here. Now, complaints through this system can't be anonymous, but they have all kinds of information on how to make a complaint. They've got a video. You can ask for help in making a complaint. They have an example of a complaint. And these different oversight bodies also have reports that you can click on, and you can see reports going back 20 years, findings that they've had. So they're very transparent, very publicly accessible. All right, so here we don't have anything like that at the state level, right? We don't have that kind of civilian oversight at the state level. So what we end up doing in Ohio and in many other states throughout the US is we're cobbling together ways to have our own kinds of oversight or relations or accountability. So in Cincinnati, Ohio in 2001, there was a young man named Timothy Thomas who was shot by a police officer. He was running from a police officer. He was being stopped because he had some outstanding warrants for things like some stops and some traffic infractions and not wearing seatbelt. So he didn't really have a violent history, but he had some outstanding warrants. He was being chased. He ended up in an alleyway where he was pulling up his pants, right? So this is 2001. He was wearing some very baggy pants, and an officer met him face to face in the alley and thought he was going for a weapon. He was unarmed and he was shot and killed. So this led to the next sort of largest urban disturbance since the LA riots in 1992. And this happened in Cincinnati. So you're seeing these signs, I'm unarmed, don't shoot. You're seeing protesters engaging with officers. This is a pretty dramatic photo here. Protesters hopping a fence. I think there was some tear gas deployed. And so as a result of this incident with Timothy Thomas, there was a collaborative agreement that was established. And this collaborative agreement came about from investigations by the Department of Justice, as well as a consent decree where the city of Cincinnati had to change and reform their policing in order not to have to deal with any litigation from the ACLU and other groups that were suing the city. And so it resulted in three main outcomes. So changes in the use of force policies that were introduced, the introduction of tasers. So this was the first time that tasers were really introduced more broadly so that they would not have as many deadly encounters with police officers. They also had de-escalation tactics. They also established a citizen complaint authority board, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, and bias-free and community-based policing. And these measures have been used as a model, really. Cincinnati became a model for community-based policing for other large metropolitan areas throughout the United States. So this is Gabe Davis, and Gabe Davis is the new director of the Citizen Complaint Authority, which was established in 2002. He took over on September 6th, so very recently. And if you're interested in hearing more from him, if you want to go and do the look at the podcast Cincinnati Edition on August 25th, he was interviewed by Cincinnati Edition. So I want to show you what this looks like in Cincinnati. So this is a civilian oversight body that was established in Cincinnati, okay? And it says here at the bottom that the underlying purpose was to ensure that public confidence was strengthened by ensuring that claims and complaints were reviewed diligently while attaining a high standard of integrity. So they realized that in order to establish police community relations and trust, you need an independent and impartial forum for the review, investigation, and resolution of misconduct and complaints filed against police officers. If you go to About Us, and I think this is important for you to see here. So they have three components. They have an advisory board with 7 citizens that are appointed by the mayor, so those are civilians, a full-time director, so that's Gabe Davis now, and support staff, and a team of professional investigators, okay? So that costs money, that costs a lot of money, okay? But it says here what you need to have an effective investigation agency. Independence from the police, so that there's no conflict of interest, a focus on police misconduct in serious injuries, death, use of force, the ability to conduct investigations, inspect and examine information and make recommendations, and then unhindered access to crime scenes. All right, so that's a tall order for this kind of organization. But that's what they say you really need to have in order to be able to really have this kind of trust between the police and the community. And here you can file a complaint, and I just want to show you what this looks like. I'm just mindful of the time. So here's their complaint form. You can complain against an officer, and if you click the drop-down menu, the only thing you can do is complain against the officer, right? So even in the title of their name, the Citizens Complaint Authority, you can see that there's some heft behind what they do, all right? And they ask for a lot of information, and then you submit your complaint. I don't know, it seems like some of this might be voluntary. I haven't tried to fill one out myself, but I wanted to show you what they have in Cincinnati. Okay, so now we're getting closer to home. So now we're in Oxford, Ohio. And here we have the Oxford Police Community Relations and Review Commission. So that's PCRRC. And it was established in 2015. And for those of you, some of you may have been able to attend the League of Women Voters presentation that we had, I think it was just last week or maybe 2 weeks ago. But this came about because the NAACP had a sort of a community meeting and discussion where many members of the Black community were expressing concern over the possibility of racial profiling and bias in terms of how OPD was interacting with the Black community here in Oxford. And these stories were coming from young Black men, but they were also coming from middle-aged Black women who felt like they were being stopped more often than some of their white peers were. And so Pat Mead, who also had his own experiences because he had adopted some Black children and recognized how their experiences in Oxford were different than those of his biological children, and also from interactions he had with children that he worked with in the schools, worked with community members, NAACP, and they got together and formed the PCRRC. So it was established in December of 2015. We started meeting, I think it was in February of 2016. And these are really part of the ordinance. So our task is to improve communication between the community and the Oxford Police Department, increase police accountability and credibility with the public, create a fair and impartial complaint process, and then advise Chief Jones, the city manager, city council about policies and procedures. And those policies and procedures are matters that affect the public as well as the public perception of OPD. So let's talk about how the Police Commission differs from the Ontario Special Investigations Unit or the Office of the Independent Police Review Director and the Cincinnati Citizens Complaint Authority. So first of all, Oxford's a small, relatively quiet town with relatively little diversity. And what we find usually is that when there are robust types of oversight, they usually come because of some cataclysmic event that happened that usually involves a person of color, and then there's perhaps federal oversight or something that results in changes in police reform. And so because it's a relatively quiet town, people feel like, well, there's really nothing to worry about here, right? But I always say that, you know, we shouldn't have to wait for a bullet in the back or a knee in the neck to be concerned about police community relations, okay? So the good thing is that we were established proactively. So there wasn't some big cataclysmic event. There were concerns, there were complaints, but this town felt that it was worthy of putting something like this together before something major happened. Now, we fit what's called the review and appellate model of oversight. And this is what that essentially means. We don't have investigative authority. We aren't trained to do investigations. Give me 1 second.
I think her laptop may have died. I'm sure she'll log right back on if you can just bear with us for a second.
Not a problem.
Can you post the notes and the links in the chat while she's
Yeah.
away?
Yeah, here you go. Here are the links if anyone wants to look at those while we're waiting for her to come back.
Thanks, Geneva.
Sure. anyone knows of any questions that they might have for Dr. Franklin too, if you want to think about those and put them in the chat, you could do that while we're waiting.
If I can pipe in for a second, this has been very interesting. I really appreciate this.
I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you for joining us. Okay, she's back. Hey, Dr. Franklin. You're muted.
Everything just shut down on me. I'm so sorry about that, guys.
It's okay. We figured your computer died.
It did. I thought it was plugged in, but it got pulled out of the socket. So I'm going to pick up from where I left off.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Okay. So we have an appellate model of oversight. We've got no investigative authority, training, or experience. We don't have subpoena power. We don't have a standalone budget. So those are some of the challenges that we have. As a review and appellate model, what we are able to do is we can review investigations after they have been completed. So once there's like an internal investigation, Chief Jones will share some of those with us and we can review it and say whether or not we agreed or disagreed with the ultimate findings. But we don't really have any teeth. We don't really have any way of compelling OPD to do anything in particular. Another challenge that we have here in Oxford is that we have multiple layers of policing. And that was very difficult. When I first moved here, I remember recognizing that, we had a lot of different police departments that you can drive through and you pass state police, you pass perhaps township police, Miami University Police, and then Oxford Police. So we have a lot of different layers of policing here in Oxford. And so we have jurisdiction over the Oxford Police, but we don't have any jurisdiction over MUPD and Township. And when I say jurisdiction, again, there isn't really necessarily a lot of teeth behind what we can do. So now I want to talk a little bit about this tightrope walk that is relations and review. And I'll speak personally here. I've felt personally this tightrope walk in particular as a Black woman, and right now the only Black person on the Police Community Relations and Review Commission. And I'll talk about this in terms of some stories that I'd like to share. So. I remember one day I was sitting in Cafeña, which is a local coffee shop. And I was looking out the window that looks over High Street, sitting next to a man that I didn't know. And there was an Oxford police officer who was pulling someone over, giving them a ticket for something. And this gentleman looked at me and said something very disparaging about Oxford police generally. And so I sort of introduced myself, told him what my name was, told him that I served on the Police Community Relations and Review Commission, let him know that, we have a decent relationship with Chief Jones and that we know the officers have a hard job, but that if he had any concerns that, we would be able to entertain them. And so immediately that just shifted the interaction because I'm presenting myself as someone who has a relationship with the police, which we do, but then also letting him know that we are able to take complaints and reviews. Now, he was a man of some means. He's a father of Miami students. And so, he wasn't really terribly uncomfortable with what I said, but I found myself kind of walking this line of like, how do I present first, right? Another example were some people who were helping a family move in town. They were looking for a place to park their truck as they were helping that person move, and they were worried about getting tickets. And again, somebody said something kind of disparaging about OPD, and I happened to be walking by, and so I introduced myself and I I said, if they had any concerns, we could entertain them. And they totally shut me out. And so I've often felt like I was walking this line where I didn't really know if my job is both relations and review, how do you present to whom and why? A third story that I'll share is a young Black man who used to be on the commission. He no longer is. And we would have good conversations outside of the commission. And he would express concerns, but he never really expressed them when we were on the commission during our meetings. He was very quiet during those meetings. And one day I asked him if he would be willing to introduce me to some of his friends, because I wanted to hear stories from, young men in their teens and their 20s, young people, whether or not they felt that they were being profiled either by police or by community members who might call the police on them simply because they're Black and they're in their neighborhood. That actually happened in the neighborhood that my husband and I now live in before we moved here. And what John said to me, he said, I don't think you're going to get anyone who's going to be comfortable talking to you. And so that was a concern because, it doesn't lead me to believe that everything's wonderful. But if there's no way to find out what those stories are, then we really can't address them as much as we would like. And when we don't have a commission that has the kind of oversight power that the Cincinnati Citizens Complaint Authority has, or that we have in Ontario, then that kind of leads to sort of this hamstrung nature of Police Community Relations and Review Commission. So some of what my father shared with me about his frustrations being on that community police liaison committee is something that I have felt on this commission over the last 4 years. Now, that's not to say that we haven't had good interactions with Chief Jones. He's been at all of our meetings, but without public engagement, I think what happens is the focus tends to be primarily on relations, which isn't bad in and of itself, but then it just kind of tilts things in a way that makes it challenging when you have to start leaning into review. So we've learned a lot about OPD policies and procedures and practices. We've had different people come and present at our meetings. But now, this summer, things have changed dramatically, right? So in light of the George Floyd murder, lynching on camera in May of this summer, there's been a lot more activity here in Oxford. So there was the vigil that was held uptown. And this vigil was organized by Latricia Hillman, who's a local woman here. She spoke at that vigil, I spoke at that vigil, Chief Jones, many people from the community did. Here is the first Black Lives Matter protest that I attended that started off at the Tri-Community Park. Here, I think might be that same protest in front of the police department. We've had panel discussions on police community relations through the League of Women's Voters, the Interfaith Center, the NAACP. And Black Lives Matter has been very active, helping the community to put pressure on us as a commission, on City Council, on OPD, to get some reform and some changes happening. So what's happened since the summer, since May? So we've had additional PCRC meetings. Usually those meetings, we're supposed to meet once a quarter. We've been meeting more often than that. And I just found out we have another meeting on September 17th. So put that on your calendars, please. The city has passed a duty to intervene and a chokehold restriction. Those are ordinances. Some people might say, well, they're just symbolic. But I think that symbols matter and they're important and they say something about the values of our community. And that came from this public pressure. There's also been some initiatives from Black Lives Matter, reducing barriers to filing complaints. So asking police to give a card that has a link or a QR code to the police commission here in Oxford. We're looking for ways to have a anonymous and more publicly available complaint process. Right now, when people make complaints, they have to go into the police department. Something has to be notarized. It can be a little bit chilling for people who already feel marginalized. The second initiative was comprehensive and publicly available reporting on traffic stops, which we have been getting for some time. We're now asking for field contacts, so pedestrian stops. We've been asking that for a while, and so Black Lives Matter Oxford put that into their initiative. And then really why we're meeting on September 17th is to have a robust discussion on funding alternatives to traditional policing here in Oxford, so like social workers. And we're going to talk about strengthening our ordinance to see ways that we can have more influence as a commission. I know one of the things that people were frustrated about after our last meeting was that we didn't make stronger and more clear recommendations to City Council related to these Black Lives Matter initiatives. And it was my first time being in a situation where we were supposed to do that. And so I think what you saw there was a kind of a combination of a sleepy commission where we didn't have that much public involvement for a long time. And so we were really focused more on the relations part of things, education part of things. But now with the community input, with community pressure, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable for people on commissions or on city council or from police officers, I think that kind of pressure is vital. And so I feel like in the absence of having these kinds of oversight strengths and ability to investigate or to have subpoena power, what we really need to rely on in this community is public input, public pressure, public engagement, so that we can see the kinds of reforms that we hope to see as a community. So I'm going to end with this. Started off with John Lewis. I'm going to end with John Lewis. Do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. And it's on a mask, so please wear your masks. And we're going to end here and open it up for conversation and discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franklin. We actually already received one question in the chat. It came privately to me. It's from Arch Grieve. I work for the Dayton Mediation Center, where we're helping the city of Dayton, Ohio work through 5 different conversations related to police reform as part of an initiative led by our mayor. I'm one of the group facilitators for the Use of Force Committee, and I wonder if you'd have any advice on places to look or where to start in terms of best practices for police use of force.
So some of the links, actually, Geneva, maybe you can drop those links in the chat right now. And if that's—
So I actually already dropped them
okay, good.
in the chat when you, your
when
computer died,
yes.
but I'll send them again.
Okay. Yeah, so if that person wants to contact me, you know, I can share. I think the Cincinnati Police Department, because of the collaborative agreement, they have a lot of information that's publicly available. So you can look at the collaborative agreement, you can look at their use of force policy. Again, they were a model for many different municipalities throughout the country. So I think that would be a good place to start.
There is another question in the chat from Christina Miller. Are you aware of whether or not Oxford Police Department has the ear of Butler County Sheriff's Department to a degree that OPD could be a positive influence?
I don't know that. I know that we had some discussions when the Muslim ban started. There was a lot of concern within this community, as in many other communities, about whether local police departments were going to coordinate with federal authorities to identify people who were here, who were undocumented. And I know that our police department had a very different response to that than Butler County did. I don't know where the direction of the influence necessarily goes. I do know that we have, at the Ohio level, there's an Ohio collaborative on community policing. So if you want to Google Ohio Collaborative, and they have various standards on community policing. And so there are a lot of different police agencies within Ohio that have certification with the Ohio Collaborative. And the Butler County Sheriff's also has certification with the Ohio Collaborative. And so you can have a lot of different organizations that kind of can meet these standards, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they really interact the same way with their community. And so it's a good question. I don't know. I don't know how much of a positive influence we are on Butler County. Okay.
Yep, there's a couple more coming in the chat.
Yeah. Butler County Sheriff's Department. So wondering if you can go more into depth about the different jurisdictions, Butler County Sheriff's Department, then each individual city's department. What is the relationship, communication between them? So I know, for example, there is sort of an agreement, a mutual aid agreement that sometimes exists between different departments. So for example, like Miami University and Oxford has a mutual aid agreement. So sometimes depending on the event, they may work together and help each other out. I think if there's like a need for SWAT, that doesn't reside within OPD, they go broader than that. So I think it's like Hamilton or Butler County. And then here we have the township police, and at the League of Women Voters presentation that we had, Chief Jones talked a little bit about sometimes some frustration that he feels because a township has jurisdiction in some areas in town. Well, they have jurisdiction over all of Oxford because the city is within the township, but then they also, there's some kind of like ins and outs in the community where OPD has jurisdiction and then like just a few streets over doesn't and then does again. So there's some frustration that happens in terms of the different layers of policing. How can you reform a police liaison group in a way that will make them more effective? Well, I would like to hear from the community as well. I'm sure some of you have some thoughts on that. I think, you know, subpoena power is something that can be helpful. I don't think that I'm qualified to investigate like a crime scene, right? I'm a civilian without a law enforcement background, but I think it's helpful for us to imagine what this can look like for a small municipality like Oxford. Even if we had all the money in the world, would it be necessary for us to have the kind of oversight that Cincinnati does, for example? Or is there some other way for us to be able to enhance the community police relations without doing all of that? So Gabe Davis, who's the new director, he's a former prosecutor. So he worked for the DA's office in Manhattan. He prosecuted federal hate crimes in DC. And his father is a former sergeant in the Cincinnati Police Department. And so we probably don't necessarily need someone like that here, but what could we do? And so I'm just wondering, I see some options in the chat. Add a fourth request to Black Lives Matter proposal for improving policing in Oxford. What would it be? What would it be? That's a really good question. I think having this more direct, clear way of reporting. Really right now, because of the police union's contract, it's understood that there needs to be some kind of there needs to be a notarized complaint. You have to go and get it notarized. I think it would be lovely if that was taken off the table, if there could be some kind of memorandum of understanding where we no longer have to have complaints notarized in order to make a complaint, to file a complaint with the police. And I think subpoena power would be helpful as well. Magic wand, what three things would you like to see change concretely? All right, so speaking for myself, I'm excited about the possibility of reimagining policing and having like a social worker working within Oxford, who could address some of the concerns of the community that, that don't necessarily require police presence. I think that's crucial. It's worked well in other jurisdictions and other parts of the country. And, you know, I think one of the challenges when you come from a small town, when you live in a small town, is when you use examples from other sort of larger municipalities, oftentimes what you hear is, well, that's Oakland, that's not Oxford, or that's LA, that's not Oxford. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from other areas as well. So I would like to see that changed. I think having these contact stops, really the Black Lives Matter Oxford initiatives are solid initiatives. You know, I think we just as a commission, I'm speaking for myself, you know, hadn't had the experience of taking something and sending it to City Council to have it voted on or approved by City Council. And so we're looking forward to addressing, especially the third initiative in particular. But I think having that anonymous complaint process, and then also having officers do the pedestrian stop data. We want to see how officers are engaging with people on foot and why, right? So who are you stopping and why? Sometimes it's because someone in the community has asked officers to show up, right? So that's showing potential bias from community members. But we can't really fix anything if we can't sort of measure it first and get a pulse. Again, if I'm in a situation where a young Black man from Oxford says to me, I don't think you're going to get people to talk to you, I don't know that we can continue to put the impetus on the community members who already don't feel safe to talk to us. I think that we need to find other ways to address, to first of all, get a snapshot of what's going on and then address what's going on. All right. All right, so how can you get the community to see you as the ally for the community instead of the police cheerleader? That's a very good question, but I think that comes with some oversight and authority, right? You know, let me talk very personally here about something that I haven't shared with many people. So I want to go back to the beginning of the formation of the police commission. Talking about the tightrope walk. That summer, Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed, right? And I was actually in Minneapolis the day after Philando Castile was killed for a conference. And you could feel the tension in the air. It was a really difficult and sad time there. And as a result of those shootings, and there were also some retaliatory shootings of officers in Dallas and in Louisiana. So it was a really tumultuous time. I mean, so many things have happened since then that we almost forget things that have happened in the past. And so when that happened, I called the chair of the police commission, Pat Mead, and I said, I feel like we need to write a letter that we would present to OPD, to Chief Jones and OPD, to express our sadness over the killings of these officers, and also to talk about the importance of police oversight, police community relations. And so we started crafting this letter, and it was approved by the commission. Pat and I worked on this letter together, and well, this is almost a little difficult to talk about because when I originally wrote the letter, I wrote it chronologically. So it was the killings of Philando and Alton. Those were like a day apart. They happened one day after the other. And then there were the retaliatory shootings of the police officers in Dallas and in Louisiana. And as we were crafting the letter, Pat, and this is in his wisdom, I think, because he understood the tightrope walk, he said, you know, I think it would be better for you to start with the killings of the officers, and then go into Alton Sterling and Philando Castile as you craft your letter. Putting them first, right? Putting the officers first. And I've looked back at that letter since then, and it's painful for me to see how much I minimized even my own trauma over what had happened in an effort to stay and look balanced, right? So when we crafted that letter, we used words like, and these were my words, I think, because I think, you know, Pat and I worked together, but I crafted a lot of it. I used words like ambushed and murder to talk about the police officers. But when I was talking about Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, I used the words police-involved shooting, right? And even in my own language, I realized that I was minimizing my own anxiety and trauma and fear around that in an effort to do the tightrope walk. And I remember as I wrote it, and again, you know, I have police officers in my family, so I'm not anti-police, but as I wrote it, I remember thinking to myself, I wonder what it would take for police to write a letter to the Black community because of some trauma that happened to a Black person at the hands of police. I remember feeling like we were doing a lot of work to try and bridge the divide because we understood that, you know, without much authority, we don't have that much, I think, legitimacy overall with the police. I mean, Chief Jones has been cooperative generally, but, you know, how seriously are we able to be taken without the authority? But I just remember thinking, what would it take? Because, you know, I feel like as a Black person, I'm always trying to make people feel comfortable with my presence, with my anger, in various spaces, not just with the police commission. And this summer, I found out what it took, right? This summer, we all found out kind of what it took. It's a knee in the neck for 8 minutes and 41 seconds. And that's painful. You know, and so to answer the question, how can you get the community to see you as the ally? I think support and pressure from the community, to be honest, right? Like when the community is behind us and they're saying this, you're saying this is what you want, we will learn to function better as a commission. We will learn to have a stronger voice as a commission, and then it would allow us to be able to make stronger demands. You know, it was difficult after the last commission meeting because I found myself, again, feeling like the one Black person on the commission when I recognized how disappointed people were from Black Lives Matter Oxford and the community. And I thank the community members who did email us to let us know that they were disappointed, they thought we should have been stronger. Again, I just felt a lot of pressure. It's like I felt like I let them down as the one Black member of the commission. But again, when you're so used to focusing on relations, it's a lift to get into review, and to get into review when you don't have much authority, ultimately. So I do think that looking at the ordinance, looking at the ways that the ordinance can be strengthened is really helpful. I want the beloved community of Oxford not to stop putting pressure, not to stop staying engaged, right? So during the course of the 4 years of our commission, there were times when we had no public participation. I mean, the only people there were my husband, who comes to support me, who's wonderful, and my good friend Lexi Marsh, who would show up when she could. And the presenters, perhaps, right? But I think this pandemic, one of the other bright spots is because of Zoom, we have a lot more people who are able to participate in community engagement in these kinds of ways. And so I'm imploring you not to stop. And also, you know, learn from those of us who've been on the commission for the past 4 years. I think my term is ending in May of 2021. I think a few of us who were original members are going to be term limited out at that time. And so when the time comes to apply, please apply and stay in touch with those of us who've been on it. I mean, I'm not going to stop staying involved just because I'm not officially on the commission, but we need to have a community discussion and really have the pressure from the community to make the reforms that we want to see in this community.
Can we ask questions directly?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Amber, I applaud you. I know that it's hard not having that support. It's like a more emotional support I can see that is needed as well. When I asked you the question about being an ally in regards to the community, and of course the pressure is when there is a situation that is traumatic to those who are involved. And it's always us against them mentality for the most part when you're dealing with the community. And in our community, most of the police action commission is set up where it's basically an appreciation cheerleader squad for the police department, and the community is never polled as to what are their wants and what are their desires. Are you polling your community in order to engage them, to find out what it is that they specifically want? Are you asking them specific questions as to what are their needs and desires, especially when it's surrounding traumatic issues, but just overall as well? Are you doing that?
We are not, and we should, and thank you for that suggestion. I mean, I think Black Lives Matter Oxford, they have been, I think, one of the bigger voices, and I know they've got petitions signed, and so either through them or on our own as a commission to have some kind of form stack created, that would be fantastic, or Qualtrics survey or something where we can send it out broadly to the community and find out, you know, what their top initiatives are. What do they want? What do they need? And because again, I think one of the challenges right now is because we're seeing so many images of some of the most extreme violent interactions between the community and the police, especially Black men in the police. We lose sight of some of the other ways that mistrust can form between police and the community in terms of language that's used. There's a great paper by Jennifer Eberhardt it's out of Oakland, where they did a month's worth of body camera data, audio from routine traffic stops. And they transcribed the audio and analyzed the police language for variables like friendliness, respectfulness, politeness, formality, and they analyzed it by race. And they found that there were some really stark differences by race. White motorists, and they controlled for a lot of things, like the time of day, the type of infraction, the race of the officer. And they found that officers were more likely to say be safe at the end of a routine traffic encounter with white motorists than with Black motorists. With Black motorists, they were more likely to say things like keep your hands on the wheel. The language was just stark. They were more likely to use formal terms of address like Mrs. or Mr. or Ms., sir, ma'am. With white motorists, with Black motorists, they were more likely to use informal terms of address like dude or bro or man, possibly thinking that they were signaling some kind of like friendliness or I'm on your level, but that doesn't work when the authority level is so starkly different. It actually has the opposite effect. So I really appreciate that recommendation. Thank you so much. I'd like to hear from other members of the community as well.
Are there other questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a friend who lives in Oakwood here near Dayton, and I'm not suggesting that this needs to be the model for Oxford, but apparently their structure is that the police take turns. So they're trained to be paramedics and firefighters and police officers, and their shifts rotate through those three different job descriptions. And I'd never heard of that before, and I don't know how large Oakwood is in terms of a municipality, but I think that's really interesting. Like, I think if you are tasked with saving people's lives, attending to people in terms of EMS, in terms of a paramedic, as well as putting out fires, you have roles in the community that in which you're not armed, and then you go back into the role of police officer. I can't imagine that wouldn't shift your perception in terms of how you engage with the community. So there are so many models of public safety that I didn't know existed, and that I'm only learning about through conversations with people like you, with people from the community. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to investigate, learn more, and figure out what could work here in Oxford. I mean, I know that police are asked to do too much. They're asked to do too much, and they can't do it all well, you know, and one of the things that, I mean, there's some things that they do well, but the social work piece. So going back to the Stephen Lewis report, he mentioned that some members of the community didn't want anyone with a police background to be involved in civilian oversight at all. They felt like they couldn't trust anyone who even had a police background. Stephen Lewis's response was that, well, but some people, I mean, how else are you going to get investigative skills? How else are you going to be able to do that if you haven't had some kind of background in law enforcement? So he had faith that you could find people in law enforcement who could do impartial investigations. And he said, you know, I don't think it's reasonable for an average civilian to be able to go to school for 3 years and be able to conduct those kinds of criminal investigations. And I think that's a fair point. But then I would also turn that point around, right? And say, if a civilian can't go to a program for 3 years and be an effective investigator, then I don't think we should expect that our police officers can do 40 hours of training in social work and then be able to do the things that someone who got a master's degree is able to do, right? I mean, the argument works both ways, I think. And so, so yeah, I'm learning a lot. I'm learning as I go. You saw me stumbling through some of it because I'm still learning, but what I've learned over the past 4 years is that we are doing our community a disservice if we wait until we feel like we're experts in absolutely everything before we start speaking out and before we start engaging with the community, right? I'm learning as I go. I know a lot more than I did when I started. And so I want to encourage all of you in any ways that you can find to engage with the community, especially you women out there, because I know as women, we're often the ones who are like, oh, I don't know if I've got all the credentials yet. Get involved and learn as you go. Okay, there's another question. I live in Hamilton. I was wondering if you know of any initiatives for civilian oversight boards in Hamilton or Butler County as a whole. You know, I had someone reach out to me from Middletown. This was back in like May or June. And I responded to that person, but they never followed up with me. I know that Middletown is looking to try and create some kind of civilian oversight. I don't know about Hamilton, but I do know apparently from Pat Mead that different smaller municipalities in the area are trying to reach out to us in Oxford to get our documents so that they can learn from what we've done so far here in Oxford. So the word is out that we have something. It's not perfect. I think there are ways that it can be strengthened. But I want you to go to our website, our PCRC website, on the city website. You'll see the data reports that we get. You'll see all the members of the commission with our email addresses. You can reach out to us. I think any of us would be happy to talk to you about what we've learned and how we might be able to help.
I have a question, Amber.
Yeah.
This is Sybil Miller. Hi.
Hi, Sybil.
Good to see you, my dear.
You too.
I have a concern because I know that I think the dispatchers are all out of Sheriff Jones' office.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any way of knowing whether they're trained appropriately, whether they have any understanding about the kinds of situations that should be faced by police officers? Or do we have any concern or any way to express our concern towards dispatch, since that's often the very first entry into the system?
Yes, I have not engaged with dispatch at all. I think that would be a great presentation to the police commission. So I'm going to make a note of that. I'm getting some great ideas here. But dispatch is huge, right? I mean, I want you to think back, if you think about, I don't know how many of you know the name Tatiana Jefferson. She's in Texas. She was killed when a neighbor called for a wellness check on her home. It was 1 a.m. Her door was wide open. The lights were on. She was playing video games with her 13-year-old nephew on a hot summer night. And that's why her door was open and the lights were on. But her neighbor was concerned, called dispatch and asked for a wellness check. I don't know where things fell apart. I don't know exactly what, I think dispatch may have sent out an open structure call, which is different than a wellness check. And the police officer, rather than knocking on the wide open door and walking in and saying, police, you know, is anyone here? Do you need help? They tiptoed around the house with their guns drawn. And a Tatiana Jefferson, living in Texas, and I guess being a good Texan woman, she was armed, right? You have the right to defend your home. And she pulled up a blind because she thought that someone was going to break in and had a gun pointed, and the officer was right in front of that window, and he shot her. And it's on body camera, right? And he shot her because she had a gun pointed at him, but she had a right to protect her house. And so I think dispatch is huge, you know, you know, how do they convey the call, and what do they learn from the person who's calling? How do they convey that? I think that would be a great presentation to find out how they're trained and how they share information. But I think that a Tatiana Jefferson story really stuck with me because in a way it fits with that body cam footage research that I shared with you, to the extent that, again, I think when officers engage with communities of color, oftentimes, too often, they're operating defensively rather than from like a safety for the community perspective, that whole be safe. And that needs to change. And I think because in Oxford, we don't have a sizable Black community, but we do have, like, there's Parkview Arms, right? Which was an apartment complex with many people who are from a lower socioeconomic bracket. And I know in one of our police commission meetings, we were talking about Parkview Arms, and Chief Jones said, look, poverty is not a crime. You know, he's not looking to police poverty. So we have a good chief. But what we keep saying on the commission is that we can't rely on personality, we have to rely on policy, right? Because Chief Jones won't be the chief forever. And even with Chief Jones, there's been some tension, there have been ways that we've needed to push. But if we have good policy in place, then we can see the kinds of reform that will last across administrations in policing. But Sybil, thank you for that suggestion.
And I realized that Sheriff Jones, a totally different person, was recently on national TV talking about how if you shoot at his cops, you'll be shot, and you know, all this tough guy stuff. So how is he training and overseeing the dispatchers if they want to play ball with their boss? I'm just hoping they can keep an open mind and view their job as the beginning of the whole process with the Oxford Police Department, and not just, you know, some kind of actor for the sheriff's point of view, which is quite different from the view we have here in Oxford.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Were there other questions or comments?
Hi, Amber, I have a question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, Brandon, I can hear you.
So Amber, first of all, as always, thank you so much for all the hard work that you do, including the emotional labor, because, you know, we understand that it can be very difficult. So full disclosure for everyone listening who might not know, I am a member of Black Lives Matter Oxford. Amber, my question for you is sort of big picture, but I was looking to get your thoughts on it. You know, there are members of our community who believe that, you know, these efforts to reassess policing in Oxford are retaliatory, or, you know, come from some sort of knee-jerk hatred of police and things like that. And how do we, I mean, all of us who are interested in this, how do we dispel that misconception, and how do we, you know, unite the community and bring those folks on board? And the reason I'm asking is because, you know, the way that I see these things is that we're trying to make Oxford and OPD, you know, we're trying to make Oxford as good of a place as it can be, right? It's not about, you know, retaliation for something that happened in some faraway city. It's just more about, you know, making sure that Oxford is really living its values and providing services to the community that it needs. So how do we bring those folks on board and you know, to to work with us to make the city better?
I think, so Geneva dropped in, there's a great website called Both Sides Living Room Conversations. And I know this feels like a softball approach, but I do think that trying to get people in the room to have these structured intergroup dialogue type conversations can be one way to start. I know that, I don't know if Jonathan Kunzman is on the call or if he was, but dropped out. But he is a researcher here at Miami in the psych department. And we've talked about the fact that engagement with different kinds of people are some of the best ways to push these initiatives forward. But I think one of the reasons why we get that response, right, is because something flares up and then there's all this community response. And then it dies down. And then something flares up and there's a lot of community response and then it dies down. And so there's a reason why people have the perception that it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction, right? It's because that's often, we don't have sustained engagement. And I think if we have sustained engagement, and I'm talking like for the long haul, then it just becomes part of the culture, right? It becomes part of the culture. And then you stop, I don't know, we'll try it and we'll see, right? But then maybe you're less likely to get that response of like, you're just doing this because of something that happened in Minneapolis, for example. But I want to say something else. I mean, there's a website called the Officer Down Memorial Page, and you can go and they have an honor roll. They list all the officers who've been killed in the line of duty or duty-related areas. And whenever I get an opportunity, I talk about the fact that I go there and I look at that and I reflect upon it because these are public servants. These are frontline workers, right? Civil servants who are putting themselves in harm's way for our protection, but that's part of their job, right? They've chosen a dangerous job to do, and it is dangerous. But, you know, when we wrote that letter to Chief Jones and to the police department about the shootings in Dallas and in Baton Rouge, they didn't say, why are you giving this to us? That didn't happen in Oxford, that happened in Dallas and Baton Rouge. They said, thank you. They said, thank you, we appreciate that, because it was a recognition that as a community, when one person hurts, they're all hurting, right? I want to have that same respect, right? I think that there needs to be that understanding that, like, yes, it happened in Minneapolis, but it's affecting the nation. And so, you know, I think in Oxford, sometimes we suffer from a little bit of a Oxford exceptionalism, or it can't happen here, or maybe even a little Miami to think in such a place. You know, we're part of the United States. I mean, you know, this systemic racism, the systemic racism in policing and all of our institutions and structures, it's in the groundwater, affects us no matter where we live, to a larger or lesser extent, right? Depending on the makeup of the community, depending on the quality of the police force. But I agree with you, Brandon, we're looking to make Oxford the best that it can be. And I think that Oxford could be a model. I know that this police commission, when it was first proposed, there was some contention about its very existence. I think there was some pushback, like there was in Ontario for this, the Special Investigations Unit, there was pushback. I think whenever there are large reforms that come from the community, I think we need to understand and expect that there's going to be pushback as par for the course. But I think if you were to ask, and as a matter of fact, I know the former mayor, Mayor Kate, saw me at Cafeño one day and said, Chief Jones just like loves this commission and working with you. Now, we were still doing a lot of relations, right? There wasn't as much tension. But I think if you were to ask Chief Jones, he would probably identify the existence of the commission and his work with the commission as one of the symbols of Oxford being one of the more liberal police departments in Butler County, because he mentioned that at one of our meetings. But it doesn't change the fact that there was pushback when we started, right? So just because there's pushback now doesn't mean we won't necessarily get to a place where even police will see the benefit. And I think we also have to recognize that police officers are human beings too, with families to feed. And when they're hearing some of these reforms or hearing terms like defund the police at a very human level, am I gonna lose my job? Am I gonna be able to feed my family? Like, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we don't keep that human element in mind when we think about the reactions that we're getting from officers. That's just a real thing, right? No one wants to lose their jobs, and many people have in this pandemic. So at a time when there's even more economic insecurity, a lot of the language that we're using, I'm not saying not to say it or to say defund, but to recognize that the reaction is coming from a place that I think we as humans can all understand.
Thank you, Amber.
Thank you. And thank you all for your patience with the mishaps there in the beginning. I appreciate it.
Were there any other questions?
Geneva, is there a way you can copy and send me the chat log?
Yes, I'm recording this on Zoom, so I should have the chat record.
Okay.
So I can send that to you. I know we're coming up in about an hour and a half right now, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time, but if there are any last questions or comments.
And I want to thank people who joined from Canada. I see my friend Indira on the phone. I think I saw my family there at some point, but I appreciate you. Thank you. All right, everybody.
No other questions?
Hi, Barbara from California. Thanks for joining. All right, everybody.
Well, thank you all so much. And thank you to Dr. Franklin for your time. I really appreciate all of you being here. And I will send a recording out later. Should already be up on Facebook Live if you want to share it.